Welcome everybody to our next session. Today we're talking about kind of gaining HCP engagement in this largely virtual and hybrid world that we're living in. This means a lot to sales, it means a lot to marketing, it means everything to medical affairs and creating a great experience for our HCPs, even though they're touching the message in our organization in many, many different ways. It's a multi-channel world, that is for sure. So we're going to have some fun today talking about some tips and tricks on how we can create an experience that truly delivers and delights our HCP customers. And if we do that, then we know ultimately they will go ahead and take action for the appropriate patient, which means we can finally deliver on our mission to improve and extend patients' lives. Okay, so very important we get all the proper perspectives. So Monica Sukatme is here. She's got an incredible medical affairs background, running medical affairs. She's been in commercials. She's done all sorts of crazy things. I love it. Monica, it's so good to have you here and provide this perspective. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Frank. My name is Monica Sukatme. I have had maybe the last 7 years in leadership in the medical affairs arena. Prior to that, I was more in the commercial side of things. I've led global marketing teams both here and in France for a lot of the French biotechs that we see here today. I've also worked in market research, and prior to that, I have my training as a pharmacist. So it's great to be with you. Thanks, Frank.
It's great to have you here, and you got your PharmD from a great school. The Dolan family currently has a student there at MCPHS right now, which I'm super proud of. So awesome. All right. Speaking of awesome, okay, this might be my second favorite person in the world. Okay, this is Hans Kaspersetz. He's a Chief Innovation Officer at Relevate Health. He has incredible insights when it comes to us, making sense of what to do and what's working. Hans, welcome to the summit.
Hey, Frank, how are you?
Doing fantastic. Hans, tell us a little bit about what you've been up to in the last many years and what you're up to now.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. So I got into healthcare marketing, pharma biotech, I guess, 2003, founded an agency called Arteric, and in December of 2020, sold that agency to Relevate Health and merged it into it. And today, we do quite a bit of work in local and regional marketing, as well as digital agency of record work. My background is as a software developer, and my specialty is in machine learning and artificial intelligence in healthcare marketing and multi-channel marketing.
I love it. Well, we need artificial intelligence to help us turn it into more real intelligence so we can do amazing things with HCPs. So we're going to explore that today. And finally, I want to bring someone I have not met before. It's great to meet you. Dave Mihalovic, is that how I say your last name?
That's exactly right. Thanks, Frank.
Well, Dave, it's great to have you here. I'd love to learn more about you. So does our audience. So tell us all about Dave.
Yeah. So I'm the Chief Experience Officer with Juice Pharma. So running customer experience, data sciences, and the technology teams for largely AOR engagements across the pharmaceutical and healthcare ecosystem. I've been in and out of pharma and healthcare probably for about the last 22 years. I think I even outdate Hans. But I started like Hans. I started on the technology side. I was at a couple of startups, and I was employee number 13 at Razorfish, doing the development and creative side of the business, and got into the media side of the business. I was one of the partners at Rosetta, which was a company bought by Publicis a few years ago. So exited that, and since then have had a couple of senior leadership roles, like at W2O. I was the president of W2O Digital, as well as a chief operating officer before I found my way to Juice and Hans. So nice to be here with everybody.
Well, it's great to have you all here. Okay, so let's kind of set the table stakes. Our industry is in a very unique position where we've thought about multi-channel efforts. We've thought about engaging our HCPs in clever and creative ways where we can stand out and create some real value. And if you go way back in time when Takeda came to the US and I was employee number 81, there were a lot of straightforward tactics that actually worked quite well for a long time. In fact, as we were growing, we added more and more people because to have more sales staff and more medical affairs staff in a given geography, when you could walk into an office and easily see an HCP, you could deliver and delight. So why not do it more, especially if there is an impact and value is created? Well, Fast forward 20 years, we're in a really unique place. And I think most people would agree that our field and customer facing teams will need to be very agile in figuring out where they are when they interact with a customer and where the customer has been interacting with the brand, the message, the science, et cetera, using various different formats and what have you. And I think that there's a competitive advantage to those who will figure out how to succeed in this virtual and hybrid world and be able to get more access, get more engagement, and have more impact. So, Dave, I'm actually going to start with you here as I take a look at the screen. When from your unique point of view, I'm sure that you're observing many organizations, their brands, and some of their challenges. If they all share the interest in delighting an HCP customer through really clever engagements, are there any unique things that you're seeing that organizations are starting to do beyond the face-to-face, including virtual, that would be worth the rest of our audience really thinking about today?
Yeah, I come from world customer experience, so it's about the surround sound of the HCP these days. So when you think about sales engagement, I think the clever or the interesting thing that we're looking at is really aggregating more data around physicians, because we can all talk about virtual engagements and Viva Engage and the things that we're doing online to really obviously get them into the funnel. But really it's understanding more about what they're most interested in. So their attitudes, their prescribing behaviors, more data around them so we can be more relevant. So that works in two ways, not only for the virtual / personal engagement with a sales rep, but also what you're doing from a surround sound media perspective, because now with a greater degree of insight and understanding what their attitudes and behaviors are and the type of segmentation you would get into to quite a bit deeper today, what we can do from a media perspective is ensure that we're getting the message out to them consistently across all these different channels. So whether that's working through, media providers like Doximity or Relevate, for instance, or doing things that are very targeted from a programmatic perspective. So there's some interesting things that we're doing. We're even doing it at the virtual conference level because we've got that one-to-one match now on that physician. If they're at the conference, we can address them individually. So I think one innovative thing that we're looking at is working with conference vendors that can allow us to actually target physicians within the conference environment and have a more meaningful engagement, relevant engagement with them by giving them the right materials or the right assets or engagements that they might be interested in at that conference. So, it's really about, for me, the overall seamless surround sound around that physician today, because you just don't have the connectivity and the in-person experience we used to have.
Yeah, so let's talk about how this in-person experience is really changing. And I think about a lot of brands right now that they're on their way. You've got things that are in the clinic, they have not yet actually hit the market. And so many of our peers in medical affairs who are trying to create a relationship between their organization and many of these key physicians it's a very important thing. And to have to do some of this stuff in a virtual environment, or at least be able to pivot seamlessly back and forth between virtual and in person, I'm sure it's kind of like changing the ideal profile of an MSL, for example. So Monica, being in a medical affairs leadership role for many years, you've hired folks on both sides of the environment that we're in right now. Tell me about what is changing about the ideal individual in the MSL role. Give us some contrasts and what we used to rely on and maybe what we need now for those that will need to be able to adapt to this multi-channel surround sound environment that Dave described.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think the last 18 months, what we've really seen regarding, at the grassroots level, medical science liaisons or MSLs who are out there speaking to thought leaders. When we were hiring them before, we used to look for certain things like, you have to be 30 minutes away from an airport, right? You have to get to an airport to fly to wherever you need to go. Or we used to say, if someone has had experience or is a newer MSL, the training, the constant in-person training and practice that we used to have at these meetings that we had would really gear them up and prepare them for the real world when they get in front of that HCP. Now, the shift that I'm seeing is dramatic. in the hiring of MSLs. One, it no longer matters. We have broken down the barriers of geographical barriers that once existed to that proximity of an airport. There is no longer that barrier. Also, I see a greater scrutiny around the experience that MSLs should bring to the table, especially directly related to their therapeutic area. And the reason for that is we want MSLs, especially during COVID, when you can't get into a hospital, when people just want as many folks that are not sick to stay out of the hospital. We're seeing essentially more and more need for direct years of experience in that therapeutic area, because companies want a strong Rolodex. They want MSLs that have that Rolodex, that have those relationships already formed. I'm seeing this across the industry. So that's just in terms of your question about hiring. I think there's a lot of other shifts that we're seeing in terms of day-to-day work, which I'll get into later. But those are like the top two, I think, biggest hiring and recruitment changes.
Yeah, it just seems like folks need to be very agile with the data and are able to respond accordingly when they do that precious face-to-face engagement, that they're able to nail it and pick up where things left off with the brand, since there are so many touch points. So when we think about what we did before, and Dave brought up an interesting point about the conferences thing. I think about the conference strategy. That was always a big part of our brand planning. Monica's point about the hiring profile, changing, relationships are key, so we can go ahead and get attention. Hans, I want to bring this to you. When it comes to attention, when it comes to information-seeking behavior, regardless of barrier, just information consumption is changing overall. So What are you observing out there?
Well, there's a couple of interesting things, right? Data out of Accenture shows that about 48% of physicians want some mix of hybrid and live meetings with reps. And so we have data that suggests they really do value live and virtual interactions. We also have data that suggests that attention span continues to shrink, the amount of noise continues to increase, and so that very large campaigns or really heavy content doesn't perform quite as well as a larger volume of smaller pieces, more snackable content, right? And so we're moving sort of in a big transition from campaigning to continuous engagement. And what that means is we need to have technology that allows us to go out into the marketplace and really listen closely for what is of interest to our audiences. And it's best when we don't go at it with a predisposed idea, because we use a technology called topic modeling. And that allows topics to emerge out of the mix of content that we're looking at. And this is both written content, publication, social content, lots of different channels. And those topics are then measured and indexed against what are our competitors doing, what are our direct competitors, indirect competitors doing, and then how do physicians and the different target audiences interact with it. And so what we know, from the Accenture data and from other studies is that the physicians want to meet with the reps. They want to hear from MSLs, but there's a large percentage. I think it's something on the order of 57% of physicians actually report that the reps are still failing to effectively communicate. And so I think the opportunity for us is manifold, right? One is, how do we do a better job of listening? Number two, how do we do a better job of matching either KOLs or DOLs? A DOL is a digital opinion leader, to a physician in order to drive engagement with locally relevant content and data. And then finally, how do we tech enable and data enable our field sales teams and our MSLs so that they have richer engagements with those physicians and the physicians feel heard and understood?
That's really interesting, Dave. Maybe you can build on this a little bit. So if we are going to have to be really savvy with all of these different information touch points with these providers, considering the circumstances, anything that you're observing that great brands are doing to make sure that no matter what medium we use, the message continues to progress?
Yeah, I mean, I want to just one thing on that Hans had brought up, which is in the virtual environment, and this is one thing we're beginning to see. based upon data from Viva from a couple of our clients that we're engaged with now, is that when we have that focused time on the virtual engagement, say a Viva Engage presentation, we get more dedicated focused time. I think it was an increase of over 25 to 26% over a physical engagement. But what happens in that time is really important. And I wanted to address that because I think what reps need to do even more in a virtual environment is to really pull out the objections and the topics more effectively and use the content in those presentations more effectively, because you've got screen time, right? You don't have FaceTime. And so that's really important, is to be able to be nimble and change the conversation on a dime. And then to the broader point around, all these different channels and getting the message through, what the reps are able to do and what we can do through some of these channels is really mine what the topics are really important out there and what objections are really rising across different populations of physicians, and start mapping the messages to physicians more effectively. And like I said before, that can be done through the personal sales, virtual engagements at conferences, but largely through media, because you can begin to topic map against segments of physicians out there and really target them on a regular basis, which is what, Relevate is really good at.
Outstanding. So, Monica, back to you. Clearly we need our teams to be digitally enabled, savvy with the data to make sense of these things, turning data into insights. So maybe if I can lean into your leadership experience, how do you upskill these HCP facing teams, certainly in medical affairs, from your point of view, so they've got this digital competency, and again, create a great HCP experience in that precious moment where they are in front of them virtually or face to face?
Yeah, I think the challenge and the blessing in medical affairs is that we rely on insight gathering. We don't sell the drug, right? We're not bringing in the numbers and the volume for that. We're not selling the drug, but we're selling the science. And so what we rely on are these insights and the struggle. So I think that's a blessing, because it allows us to go in there with open ears and really listen to what's going on. I completely agree with Hans that it's important to do that without bringing in walking in there with our own bias, right? Our own subjective, whatever we think that we're going to get out of that meeting. Now, the challenge, though, is taking those insights and really bucketing them and making sense of that data.
Yep.
It's something that we struggle with at every company that I've been at. We struggle with taking those and bucketing those insights and translating that to something that has meaning for our company. I've been at Daiichi Sankyo, I've been at Janssen, Innate Pharma, and I've seen this time and time again, where we have trouble quantifying the impact of that data because the insights that we're getting are qualitative, right? And how do you quantify a qualitative metric, I guess, right? So I think that's one challenge. The other large thing that I've seen as a shift with virtual setting, virtual forum, is something that Hans mentioned. Create it more snackable. I really like that term that Hans used. And I think that we can build up the quantity of our engagements with HCPs and build up the quality by essentially shortening and making our presentations a lot more succinct. And I think medical affairs fails at that in general, but COVID is forcing us, I think, to be better at that. Because for all you guys know, I could be on Pinterest right now as I'm talking to you. My attention span is like in 1,000 windows at once. And when we deliver virtual presentations to HCPs, they're probably doing the same thing. That you don't know when they zoned out from whatever the hell you're talking about. They could have zoned out 10 minutes ago. And so that's why creating it more succinct and snackable, as Hans said, I think is really important.
All right, Hans, I know you've got some things you want to add to that, and then I've got a follow-up question. So take it.
Yeah. So Monica, that's a great point. My wife is texting me right now and the phone is going off on the desk like a foot and a half for me. And so you see me like looking over and I'm trying to pay attention to you and
You
Frank.
didn't hear a word I said, did you? See, you zoned out.
My wife trumps everybody. Yeah, she gets priority on everything. But there's a couple of interesting things. I like to talk. There's this thing going on, right? I like to talk about pharma campaigns, right? Whether they're medical information, medcoms campaigns and work, or commercial branded stuff as couture, right? And we're so used to doing these big launches and they're heavy and we spend a huge amount on them, right? Then we put them into the market and then we wait 6 months and then we go do it all over again, right? And its cycle repeats over and over and over. The challenge is, right, that's campaigning, right? And it's very difficult to create modular content and to build content that is responsive and reactive to what the market is telling us when it is that big, right? Now, so what do we see is what we believe we're seeing is this transformation from couture to fast fashion, right? So the H&Ms of the world, the Uniqlos of the world, right? How do we build content like Uniqlo and H&M, right? And I believe that the development of what we call content factories, right, or content pipelines, and we see this happening in lots of different companies, is the solution to that, right? They're smaller scientific, medical, sort of branded, unbranded content that comes together as modules in a matrix where we can deliver those different pieces of content in different ways, right? So that they come together to do something really remarkable. What I wanted to sort of key in on was you were talking about the bucketing of the insights. And we saw the same challenge, right? Starting back in 2016. And so Dave and I are really fortunate. He and I have collaborated on 5 launches over the last year, since March of 2020. 3 or 4 of them in neuro, 2 of them in gastro, 1 of them in gastro, sorry. And over that period of time, Juice Pharma, Relevate Health has developed something called LexEdge, right? Which is a lexical analysis tool, which actually allows us to map the HCP or consumer journey, go out into the market, have the topics emerge naturally, whether we're talking about, what's happening with our MSLs, what's happening with our reps, what's happening in printed content. And then we map those topics that emerge naturally against primary research and against the clinical data. And then out of that comes actionable insights that we're able to give back to the MedComps MedInfo team, Med Affairs team. We can give it to the commercial team and even sometimes to the corporate affairs team, so that they can move out into the market using those insights that came from those different sort of sources of content. This has taken us about 5 years to develop. It's not easy, and it requires us to use a lot of natural language understanding technology to do it at scale, because we might look at, in the case of, we did it for AstraZeneca and on Lynparza a couple of years ago, we looked at 750,000 customer interactions in order to map out those insights around a new product indication, right? And then those were fed back into the media team. They were fed back into Med Affairs. They were fed back into the commercial team. And it actually changed the trajectory of the performance of the brand at the time, right? Because they were able to look at such a large quantity of data and then map it down to really actionable insights. But you have to, it's one of those things, you have to make a choice to do it. And the challenge becomes, sometimes it bridges several teams, right? You might have your analytics team involved, you might have your commercial team involved, you might have your medical affairs team. And if it's early enough in the process, you'll have the clinical development team involved, right? Because you want to look at the kinds of information you collected during clinical development or even from your patient advocacy group. We just saw that session a couple minutes ago. How do we take the insights from those sort of interactions and then pull them forward into commercial or into medical so that we can have richer, more directed conversations with our physician partners? We can't hear you, Frank.
I think you're on mute, Frank, and Dave too.
Dave and Frank are both on mute.
Yeah, I'm off. My son was walking around behind me making too much noise. So.
Sorry about the muting here. So, Dave, I wanted to bring you into the conversation here. Let me position something to you. We speak to a fair number of physicians, and when I think about this virtual hybrid world that we're in, and these providers engaging in information touch points with brands in different ways than perhaps they consumed previously. I think the overarching theme is that they don't really have an information finding issue as much of an information filtering issue. There's just so much that's getting pushed at them every single day. It's funny, and Monica, I know you can relate to this. As you know, as a pharmaceutical decision maker, on average, our stats say that we get 41 solicitations a day. We did some research with a partner of ours that does market research, and they said that many providers are getting upwards of 400 solicitations a day from various life science interests, med tech, device, digital health, not just pharma, biotech, some of the standard stuff. So give us a framework for thinking. If we're running a brand, if we're running medical affairs, and we know that our providers are inundated with information, what might be some savvy ways where we think about our strategy or we think about the tactics around it so our brand can be in front and beat out the white noise?
Yeah, and that's for me, right?
Yeah.
Just thank you because you brought up Monica. Yeah, so I mean, from a with the amount of information and solicitation that's going on, I'm going to go back to what Hans had said before, which is all about relevance, because you can only you have a certain particular interest, right? When you're whether it's you're talking to a sales rep, whether you're looking at something online, you're looking for information online through search, you're on social media. There are things that percolate to the top in terms of the topics or things that you're interested in. So our ability to be the most relevant with that particular message is really important. So when Hans was talking about things around the lexical analysis or understanding the different topics that are most interesting, that's really important, because in order to be able to filter through and sort of shine a light on a physician when they're potentially going to be interested in engaging with us, it's all about understanding what topic they might be interested in to be the most relevant. I think format is important too. We talked about short form snackable content. I think the old school modality of advertising, the more static content, doesn't work as effectively today, because when you look at all these channels, what you're faced with from outside of pharma, because physicians also look at content and advertising outside of pharma. It's rich, right? So we're talking about videos, we're talking about infographics, we're talking about different formats of content that are peering through, and that's the way to get their attention. So relevance and format are two really important things that we have to look at as we go to market.
Thank you. That's excellent. That's excellent. So Monica, can I ask you, when we think about this information kind of like filtering challenge that exists for some of these providers from a medical affairs perspective, since your teams, your peers are focused on the science, so less perhaps about more traditional commercial problems like counter detailing or what have you. But when it comes to maybe some of the science and the questions that are coming forward, have you noticed in the last few years with this inundation of information in different channels, or even COVID specifically, if it turns out this is the case, that you're finding more misinformation in some of these HCP encounters?
Yeah, I would say, well, I think I don't know if I would. I don't know if I have an answer for the misinformation on pharma's side in light of COVID. I will say that with HCPs getting really inundated with information, many times they're getting inundated from the same company with information. Different divisions like sales and medical affairs, and health economics, outcomes research, and market access, right? From 4 or 5 different directions from the same company. And I think that's a solvable problem. And I think that's more solvable than solving the inundation from every other company. We can't control that. But what we can control is what we're doing, what our company's doing. And I think that's, in light of COVID, what I've seen is a lot closer cross collaboration between medical affairs and commercial, more kind of introductory joint visits virtually or on the phone, where either you have a segment where you're talking, where the MSL is talking about the science, and and then passing it off to the sales rep who might not be on the call if there's off-label discussion or whatnot. In a compliant fashion, having that discussion jointly is, I think, a solution that many companies are adopting to solve this problem of inundation from the same company. So I think cross-functional collaboration, more succinct presentations. I think when you have something like an indication update or a new indication for a product that's maybe already on the market, really having that a lot shorter, like we talked about before. I'm seeing a greater interest since COVID in the pipeline of companies pipeline, as opposed to what's already on the market, which physicians may already, have seen, like you said, been inundated with so many folks already on that product. Medical affairs really is the only one of the only groups that can talk about the pipeline of a company, and there's more interest in that. And as long as it's compliant, meaning that it's not, it's unsolicited, from the medical affairs side, I'm seeing a lot more interest in innovation and science that's coming into the pipeline. So those are just some of the things I think, changes that I'm seeing and ways to kind of avoid inundation, as you said, of products that are maybe already on the market, and how we can separate ourselves as a result.
So maybe where there's inundation, we can turn it into innovation. So Hans, let me ask you, this is either an easy question or an impossible one. You're going to have to tell us. But when you think about all of the analysis that you've done on information exposure and consumption on the HCP side, and then all of these strategic discussions you have with brands, what's the gap between the two parties that if someone were to solve it, they would actually be able to gain advantage in this hybrid world?
That's a really hard question, Frank, because the gap is different depending on which organization and what level of maturity they're at and what level of innovation they're willing to adopt and how much risk they'll take. What's relevant for us and what's relevant for Dave and I and at Relevate and over at Juice right now is our mission to deliver highly relevant information to every HCP on time across the right channel, right? And what we know from the data is that information that's delivered from a trusted source, so a key opinion leader, a digital opinion leader, a HCP's friend, right? Somebody they know locally, has way more impact and way more engagement than any information delivered by a pharma brand or any other source, period. And the distance, the physical geography, the distance between the KOL's physical location and their target has a tremendous impact on the level of engagement that we're seeing. So what this means is that there's an opportunity really to do a lot of local regional marketing using key opinion leaders and digital opinion leaders to have outsized impact, right? And we see ROIs, 14 to 1, 7 to 1 doing these kinds of programs. Like, we know that they actually work. We've been doing it for almost a decade.
Wow.
The gap, right, is that you need to be able to do local marketing and regional marketing. And we're talking on the order of MSAs or on the order of cities, right? Or zip codes. We're not talking about states or regions, right? Districts, but at national scale. And I think what's happening is, I think one of the gaps is, how do we get brand managers to think locally at national scale? How do we help them to adopt strategies that seem not scalable and to do it at scale, right? And so how do you do this, right? There's a couple of things. First of all, you need to use a lot of data. You have to understand, and you have to do a lot of KOL optimization. We saw one set of email campaigns that was KOL sent move from 4% open rates to 12% open rates just by optimizing the KOL physician relationship, right? And that is based on a number of factors around how they relate to each other and how they know each other in the physical world. And so when you see that stuff, you use the data. Secondly, using locally relevant healthcare information paired with your national campaign makes your national campaign, your efficacy data, your safety data, your dosing data, et cetera, much, much more relevant to the physician, and it increases the likelihood that they're going to engage with that content and then share it with somebody else within their practice or within their geography, right? So we don't want to send information about, sort of disease incidents or prescribing behaviors in Boston to somebody in Cincinnati. Those two markets behave in completely different kinds of ways. Also, the level of access you have is completely different. So we use a lot of data to do that. But the gap from, sort of the agency side or sort of your marketers and your branded folks is, how do we do this stuff that appears unscalable at national scale to drive remarkable results? And you need really, really good partners. You need a lot of data, and you got to work out some good, solid systems to move that content through the the MLR process and out into the field.
Simple, not easy.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So, Dave, let me ask you: how does industry, biopharma, medtech, cross the chasm to deliver more HCP value?
Yeah. So I think it's a combination of factors, right? Because there are three things we're really talking about. The unification of an experience. It's around the medical affairs piece of it, which is so intrinsically important in order to be able to deliver a very specific science message, but doing it in a in a more modular way, or being able to address concerns in a more agile way. From the sales rep or the sales engagement perspective, to be more focused in delivering messages, but also cultivating exactly what the topics or interests or objections are, so we can be smarter, especially if we're handing it off to medical affairs, right? And then the third piece is the ability to engage at large through media. So being able to utilize that as sort of the backbone of all of our messaging. So working very closely with those three folks together, right? Medical affairs, sales, and then overall marketing and brand teams to create that sort of immersive surround sound experience. I think that's important, and being able to be very relevant, agile, and topical in doing that. I think we've worked in this balkanized environment for so long, where brand marketing and med affairs and sales were not connected at the hip. I think we need to be connected at the hip in order to be as relevant as possible. So that's going to be very, very critical. A greater unification of those teams.
I love it. That is great. Okay, so as we wrap up, we ask for advice. So you think about your audience and you think about your point of view on this particular topic. If our teams, in whatever role we play in our life science organization, if we really want to be successful in this virtual and hybrid world that we're in, so every time we are in front of an HCP, we create incredible value and interest and follow-up, and perhaps even action towards doing things with the science that are appropriate and meaningful. Dave, Hans, and then Monica, what advice do you have for us to be successful in this environment?
Be flexible. Be ready for the unexpected, because I think COVID proved that, right? Because look at what we had to do over the course of the next year. We've fundamentally changed the foundation the way we communicate with HCPs. I was actually pretty impressed with a lot of the organizations we work with their ability to turn on a dime, right? There are those that are laggards and are not there yet. So I think flexibility and agility in this age, and the willingness to adapt and adopt digital technology in order to do that, is absolutely critical. Because when's the next time this is going to happen? I mean, we're still in the midst of it, but when's the next major calamity befall us, and we've got to change the way we work.
Yeah, great time to embrace the lessons that have been forced upon us, for sure. Hans, what advice do you give our audience?
Well, first, I'd tell the audience to hire Monica. You need great medical affairs leaders who are innovative and thoughtful and are experienced. I mean, really, this is a people game. There is no amount of technology, there is no amount of data, there is no amount of automation that overcomes the creativity and thoughtfulness that comes from good leadership, right? And people who are excited and enthusiastic and just want to change the world, right? I mean, because that's what happens, right? When we had 3 launches scheduled last year, all 3 of them moved. One of them moved by like 5 months because of COVID. Not the PDUFA dates, just our client was like, yeah, we're not launching right now. And we went from it having what were going to be standard launches to completely virtual launches where there were no rep visits at all, right? And there were no MSL physical visits at all. And physicians were trying to learn about new products with new indications and new mechanisms of action in the middle of COVID, right? That is not a technology problem. That is a people problem. That is an innovation problem. And it takes really, really smart people to do that. And folks like, Dave over at Juice, Frank, the people you bring on to this program, Monica and et cetera. So that's my advice, right? Great partners work, but it comes down to people.
It always comes back to people for sure. So Monica, what advice do you have?
Thank you. And thanks, Hans. I hope I get a bunch of hiring offers after this. That'll be really interesting. I will say that I think showing up is half of it, but showing up with energy and passion, letting that HCP know that you care about exactly what he or she cares about. I think the data that Hans's company, Relevate Health, brings is very necessary for success. I think that we need to be equipped with that data when we show up in order to be successful. It's necessary, but not sufficient. And I think that energy and passion for the science, when a physician or an investigator sees that, it's evident. So I'd say show up, and don't show up like and I'm going to get a lot of backlash for saying this, don't show up like a PhD. I have PhDs who report to me, and my husband's a PhD, so that's why I think I'm allowed to say that. But PhDs, MDs, and PharmDs, those are the prerequisites, right, for an MSL. And I think that there's often this stereotype around bench scientists, right? That and we all know what it is. But when you show up, have that energy and passion, and I think that's what's going to make or break the success of your company and your product.
Great advice from the three of you. I think it's just so important for many organizations to take that advice, to be agile, to use the data, the insights, kind of think differently, as well as I think you've ensured everyone that they also need to take into account that both the needs and the expectations of the customer are also changing, not just what we're allowed to do in the field of play in the new world that we're working in. So Dave, Hans, Monica, on behalf of the audience, thank the three of you for your time and treasures today. We really appreciate having you here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
Thanks, guys. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. We'll see you in the next session.